Thank you for joining us. I'm Toke Eit, the director of the Keynes Fund in Cambridge, and my guest today is Dr. Isabelle Roland. We're here to talk about your new Keynes Fund project, Forbearance Lending as a crisis management tool, evidence from Japan. What is your research question?
We study the aggregate consequences of a phenomenon called forbearance lending. This is a situation where lenders find it in their interest to keep otherwise non-performing loans alive by easing repayment conditions for troubled firms, for example, through extended repayment periods or reduced interest rates. In times of crisis, such as the global financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic, where corporate bankruptcies and unemployment threaten the livelihoods of millions, as well as the health of the banking sector, forbearance lending might provide temporary relief for struggling firms that are otherwise solvent. It can therefore prevent a wave of bankruptcies and a spike in job losses in times of crisis. However, forbearance lending is not without negative consequences, especially when it is also targeted at struggling firms that are fundamentally insolvent. Indeed, in that case, forbearance leads to the misallocation of credit across firms and in turn results in lower aggregate productivity. There is therefore a trade-off between positive and negative effects. We study this trade-off using Japan as a case study. The Japanese policy response to the global financial crisis included the so-called SME Financing Facilitation Act of 2009. This act effectively mandated banks to ease repayment conditions for troubled SMEs. It also allowed banks to exclude the restructured loans from their reported non-performing loans under the condition that the restructuring plans were expected to make the loans perform again within 5 years. The act expired in 2013, but the practice seems to have endured, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic might have resulted in the continuation of this practice. The conditions of the Act, however, should mean that forbearance lending was targeted at struggling but ultimately solvent firms that would benefit from loan restructuring. Hence, it was potentially a powerful tool for crisis management in the corporate sector.
What are you looking at that hasn't been addressed before?
We address two gaps in the literature. There is a vast literature on forbearance lending during the lost decade in Japan and the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. Most contributions are firm level, bank level, or industry level studies. These are very valuable in the sense that they provide evidence that forbearance indeed took place and that it had negative consequences. However, with very few exceptions, these studies lack an estimate of the aggregate impact of forbearance lending, and such a quantitative assessment matters for policy. An important question is indeed whether policymakers should worry about forbearance, and an assessment of its aggregate impact is necessary to provide an answer to this question. Another question that we address is whether policymakers should actually welcome forbearance or even mandate it under certain conditions. To answer this question, we have to incorporate the positive effects of forbearance into our research. Those positive effects are actually largely overlooked in the literature. The benefits of forbearance lie in the avoidance of a massive wave of bankruptcies and job losses when the corporate sector is under threat from a severe shock, such as a financial crisis or a pandemic. And we attempt to provide an aggregate view of those benefits and contrast them with the costs in terms of aggregate productivity.
How is your research innovative?
In addition to addressing two gaps in the literature, we develop a novel theory-driven empirical approach which enables us to estimate the extent of forbearance without direct observational data on loan restructurings. This is important because researchers seldom have access to data sets that record individual bank loans to firms and their characteristics. We develop a simple search and matching model of credit markets with incentives to forbear and combine it with the Tokyo Shoko research dataset on Japanese firms. Our simple model captures the two salient features of forbearance lending, namely the extension of loan maturities and reduced interest rates. The model guides us in the estimation of forbearance incentives on the basis of relatively modest data requirements on the firm's stocks of bank debt and interest payments. In other words, the model can be taken to the data to estimate the unobservable distortions induced by forbearance. Importantly, the model also allows us to perform counterfactual exercises, which allows us to assess the aggregate consequences of forbearance lending. Our counterfactual exercises enable us to contrast the productivity losses due to forbearance with the gains in terms of jobs and firms that would otherwise be lost. And this is crucial when assessing whether policymakers should worry about forbearance lending or rather welcome it as a useful tool in terms of crisis management.
What wider social issues do your research address?
Over the last decade, the world has been hit by a series of severe crisis episodes, including the global financial crisis, the European sovereign debt crisis, and now the COVID-19 pandemic. Our research speaks to the wider theme of societal resilience in the face of severe and potentially global shocks and the need for responsive public policy. The recent crisis episodes have contributed to forbearance lending becoming a widespread practice. At the same time, many countries have witnessed a fall in productivity growth, and forbearance lending has therefore acquired a bad reputation as one of the potential drivers behind the productivity slowdown, not least because it echoes the lost decade of economic growth in Japan during the 1990s. But at the same time, forbearance lending is a potentially powerful crisis management tool that can help firms weather times of severe financial distress. Its benefits include the avoidance of a wave of bankruptcies and job losses, which both can contribute to the destruction of valuable productive capacity and threaten the livelihoods of millions of people. Therefore, we want to provide a more nuanced analysis of forbearance lending by weighing its costs and benefits. If properly designed with conditions such as those attached to the SME Financing Facilitation Act of 2009 in Japan, mandated or voluntary forbearance lending programs could become a valuable tool for weathering severe economic storms. And there is a need for policies that increase the resilience of our economies to global shocks, and we aim to contribute to this research agenda.
How can your research help us understand more about the economy and society?
Well, despite the vast literature on the topic of forbearance lending, we think that there is still room for improving our understanding of its consequences. In particular, we aim to shed light on some of its potentially large benefits as a crisis management tool. The literature takes a rather dim view of forbearance lending, and this is of course not without good reason, as it has negative consequences for productivity and the resilience of the banking sector. However, we think that the view should be more balanced and the benefits of forbearance deserve proper attention. The topic is particularly relevant for policy making because forbearance lending has emerged as a widespread practice in the aftermath of successive crises over the last decade. It used to be a phenomenon mainly associated with Japan, but it is now widespread across Europe. In the future, our economies will continue to be exposed to severe global shocks, no doubt one day as a consequence of climate change. Therefore, well-designed forbearance programs have the potential to become a powerful policy tool. And the first step in designing such programs is to recognize the benefits of forbearance lending and their magnitude as compared to the losses in terms of productivity. Blanket forbearance for all firms comes with severe risks, not only to productivity, but also to the stability of the banking sector. Therefore, we need to start thinking about intelligent designs for forbearance programs. And the challenge lies in distinguishing between struggling but solvent firms and those that are insolvent and need to exit the markets. And the pandemic is a good example of a crisis where such a policy tool would have been valuable. The emergency assistance packages for firms took a blanket approach in most countries. And this means that the policy response might have created a large number of zombie firms, thereby undermining the reallocation of resources and productivity growth. A well-designed approach to forbearance, mandated by the regulator, to allow banks to support struggling but solvent firms, possibly with attached public guarantees, might have been a better approach.
One of the objectives of the Keynes Fund is to strengthen the research base in Cambridge and help younger researchers establish themselves. How does your project do that?
The project started as a collaboration between myself and Professor Yukiko Saito at Waseda University in Tokyo. I am a junior researcher at the University of Cambridge, having joined as a college associate lecturer at the end of 2019. In addition, our third team member, Philipp Schnattinger, is a student in a final stage of his PhD at the University of Oxford. The project will no doubt help him consolidate his own research. Finally, we have hired a research assistant among the DPhil students here in Cambridge, and the project should provide her with a good opportunity to acquire valuable experience of what academic research involves. And without the support of the Keynes Fund, we would not have been able to both hire a research assistant and purchase the necessary data sets for our project.